Good evening to all of you that are on the line. We've got about probably 3 minutes before we get started, but I see about 25 of you out of the 61 we're expecting have joined. So I just wanted to say hello and welcome to all of you and ask you to please just sit tight for about 3 minutes. We'll start promptly at 6:30. So again, welcome to those of you that are on the line. I look forward to hosting you over the next hour and a half. Okay, welcome again to all of you. It's 6:30 and I promised to get started promptly at 6:30. So here we are gathered for the first of a 5-part webinar series that I have been gratefully chosen to be the host of. So again, welcome to all of you. I think we have about 61 people registered to participate in this evening's session representing 32 schools. So I'm in a beautiful position from where I'm sitting because I can see all the names on my screen and I can see that attendee number going up as people join. So that's just so exciting to me to have so many of you participating. One of the reasons why we have so many participating is because we have 3 authorizers represented this evening: Northern Michigan University, Lake Superior State University, and Ferris State University. So as all of you know, as you've heard from your authorizer, we've opened up this professional development opportunity to all board members that are representing those 3 universities. So just absolutely thrilled to be able to offer these sessions on a broader scale. I've had the good fortune of delivering professional development via webinar to those boards appointed by Lake Superior State University for the past several years. So for Lake Superior State University appointed boards, I want to say welcome back. And again, for those of you that are new to this particular webinar format, professional development format, particularly those with Ferris State University and Northern Michigan University, I want to welcome you to this session. I also want to give a shout out to your authorizers for offering this opportunity to all of you, and again, for choosing me to host it. So if you haven't thanked them, please do. This doesn't come free of charge, so they have been willing financial supporters of this opportunity on your behalf as well. So please, again, thank them if you haven't done so already for this opportunity. For those of you that don't know who I am, and I'm not seeing many names on my screen that might not know that, but let me offer that anyway. My name is Angie Irwin. I am the owner of Irwin Educational Services, which is a consulting company I started roughly 6 years ago. I've been engaged in charter schools work both in Michigan and nationally for roughly 25 years. And I always like to say to my groups, particularly those when I'm in person, that I started this gig when I was about 10 years old. So you can feel free to do that math. And just am absolutely thrilled to continue to be a part of this exciting educational reform initiative. So a little bit about me. Want to share with you just a couple of housekeeping items before we actually get into our session this evening. This session, as well as all the subsequent webinar sessions that we'll be journeying through, is being recorded. It's being recorded for the purpose of your access and your reference after tonight's session, and for use with your full board. So if you have board colleagues that weren't able to participate in this evening's session, the recorded version will be exactly as you hear it this evening, and hopefully you'll be able to take advantage of that opportunity in a collective board setting. Usually it takes about a week to get the recordings in workable order and then posted on what will likely be the respective authorizers' websites. If there is a different medium in which they choose to post the session, we will certainly let you know that, but just plan on it being the websites of your respective authorizers for the time being. So that's the first housekeeping item. The second housekeeping item I want to discuss with you is participation opportunities. So I understand that in a webinar setting, it's a little more challenging to deeply engage with the host, with the facilitator, but I want to offer a couple of different ways that you're able to do that this evening. On your computer screen, you should see a hand icon. If you at any point in time click on that icon, I will see it on my screen next to your name. That cues me that you have a question, comment, information to share. So I will unmute you. So if those, I think you're all muted, but if any of you are not, if I haven't muted you, which I think I have, please mute yourself just to avoid any interference. I will unmute you and allow you to ask your question, share your comment, feedback, whatever you might have. So that's one way that you can participate. Another way is through your chat pane or your questions pane on your computer screen. You'll see what I think you'll see. This is what I'm seeing. So I think you see a similar screen. You'll see a place for questions and you'll see a place for chat. So I will be monitoring all of those throughout the webinar session this evening. And again, as I see questions in the questions pane, chats in the chat pane, a hand raised adjacent to your name, I will certainly stop what I'm saying and invite you to speak. With one caveat, we are going to have, like I said, about 61 people participating this evening, so it might take me a minute or two to scroll through the names. So if I don't get to you right away, please just be patient and know that I will get to you as soon as I scroll down the list and see that either hand icon or that question that you might have. We do have authorizer representation on the phone this evening. I believe Ferris State is on the line. I believe Sharon Hopper is with us. Lake Superior State University is represented, and I believe Northern has representation as well. So throughout this webinar session, as questions are raised, as comments are shared, as feedback is desired, we will engage your authorizer if appropriate and necessary as well. So a good opportunity for you to ask any specific questions of your authorizer if indeed the desire surfaces or if the need arises. So I believe that's it for housekeeping items. So without further ado, as I like to say, let's advance the screen and launch into tonight's presentation, which is all about preparing, reviewing, and managing the board meeting agenda. And this whole series is really reflecting on those board best practices. So as we look at board best practices, we want to first start with the meeting agenda. And as we look at the subsequent sessions in the webinar series, you'll see a pattern that I'll talk about in a minute relative to those subjects that we've chosen for this series that will launch tonight and take us through May. So let's go ahead and advance this slide. We'll use this template to guide us. Oh, happy fall, by the way. You'll see I have a fall template that is hopefully visually pleasing to you as we work through tonight's session. So the goal for discussing the preparation, the review, and the management of the board meeting agenda is for all of you to get in a position where you're feeling comfortable about engaging in efficient and effective board meetings. So this is our goal for tonight's discussion. This will likely be our goal for the entire series, because as we walk through all the topics, as we journey through this together, this is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, right? And this is what we know you want. All of you as board members would prefer nothing better or more than to attend meetings and ensure their efficiency and effectiveness. So I'm going to pause right there, and I'm going to walk you through the webinar series as we've talked about this whole notion of efficient and effective board meetings. So obviously tonight we're talking about the agenda. When we reconvene as a group in January, right now that date's January 15th, but don't get hung up on those dates tonight, because we'll continue to remind you of the dates as they draw near. When we reconvene for webinar number 2, we're going to capitalize on this whole notion of efficiency that we're going to talk about tonight, and we're also going to talk about orderly meetings. So webinar 2 is going to be a little more procedural. So this is where I'll introduce open meetings guidance, where we might talk about Robert's Rules of Order, parliamentary procedures, just kind of those procedural parts of a board meeting that professional boards, right, leadership boards, as some of you have heard me talk about, prefer to follow. So that's going to be really the genesis for webinar number 2. Webinar number 3, which right now is scheduled for February, is going to address this whole notion of reporting. So reporting relationship between the board and management, but not just the board and management, reporting relationship relative to what you see in terms of the reports, and then how you engage in dialogue regarding those reports that you receive. So the whole sort of general concept of reporting is going to be discussed in that session. Webinar number 4, we're going to talk about this notion of old and new business, right? We all see it on the meeting agenda, but how should we be thinking about that practically and procedurally? So once you learn procedurally from webinar number 2 how to address all this, we're going to really apply it to that old and new business webinar discussion in April. And then finally, webinar number 5, we're going to talk about adjourning the meeting and next steps. So I'll just share it with you. One of the authorizers had indicated to me as we were putting this series together that, you know, I think his comment was, Angie, you're good, but I don't know how you are going to get 90 minutes out of a meeting that discusses adjournment, and next steps. So I've got some surprises in store for all of you for that session, so please stay tuned. We got a little time, but just know that we will get time out of that discussion as well, and hopefully informative discussion, just as I hope to have this evening. So you see a pattern here, right? I'm hoping you see the pattern unfold. This series is really about a journey through the board meeting, right? We didn't really want to call this session that because it is about best practices relative to that journey, but we are walking you through efficient and effective board meetings by addressing each of those topics, really focused on what kinds of efficiencies and effectiveness you can bring to each of those. So again, just as some of you have participated in my professional development sessions in the past, and you've seen that consistent slide at my initial introduction that reads, the board of directors is the highest level of leadership, you will see this slide as we move forward in this series. Again, this is the overall overarching goal for the entire series, is just to help you make your meetings as efficient and effective as possible. So all of that starts with the agenda, but the reality is this. As I was preparing for this evening's session, I came across this pie chart that is reflective of a study that was conducted and published in the MIT Sloan Management Review. But basically what this is depicting is people don't generally view meetings as both effective and efficient, or effective and productive. It's an either or proposition, right? So as you look at this pie chart, you'll see that roughly 31% of the people surveyed, and these folks were Verizon and Workfront employees, really feel that their meetings are either excellent or very effective, not both, right? 38% viewed meetings as good and productive, and you see the percentages otherwise. So I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. I just thought it was an interesting image, an interesting depiction of how people generally view meetings. Not favorably. Right? Not favorably. So we want to get you as boards in a position where you actually look forward to attending your meetings, for those of you that might not feel that way, and are engaged in your meetings from this point forward. So what constitutes effective and efficient meetings? And that's really what, again, we're going to talk about this evening and in subsequent sessions. So I submit to you that effective and efficient meetings start with the agenda. Start with thoughtful agenda development. Start with comprehensive review of agenda and all board meeting materials, and then finally culminate in effective agenda management at a board meeting or at the board meeting. So I want to read to you a statement that, again, I came upon as I was preparing for this session. It's posted in boardable.com, which is a blog that is published by Dr. Linda Wastine. Linda Wastine is the owner of Wastine and Associates, based out of Iowa. She does a lot of professional development with nonprofit organizations, including nonprofit boards. This is what Linda says about the board meeting agenda. One thing I've noticed is how the board meeting agenda sets the tone for an entire board meeting and how much it determines if you have engaged or disengaged board members. So if I were with you right now, I would ask, how does that resonate? How does that feel to you? Because I think what happens oftentimes is the board meeting, because we're all operating typically from template agendas, right? So agenda development becomes a mechanical rote exercise, right? Arguably, if the agenda is mechanical, so too might the meeting be mechanical, right? So we want to change that a little bit and really get you to focus on how to develop an agenda that is going to consistently engage your board members and really help them feel enthusiastic about being at the board table. So in doing that, we're going to cover these 3 areas. So the next few slides are going to address how you should be thinking about a thoughtful agenda, how you should be reviewing comprehensively the agenda and its supporting materials, and then finally, how you should be effectively managing the agenda as well. So moving on to the next slide, thoughtful agenda development. If I were with you right now, I would hold up my notes that I have developed for this slide just itself, because it is just covered with stuff. I have chicken scratch all over my page relative to what I want to talk about this evening. So let's just walk through this. And again, what I'll try to remember to do is pause after each one of these elements and invite questions, comments, thoughts, if I don't see any coming otherwise. So as we look at thoughtful agenda development, I want to talk about really 5 key considerations. And the first 3 really tie together. So I think as you look at developing your agenda, you want to try to find that sweet spot, right? So what do I mean by sweet spot? You don't want to underload the agenda, so include too little, which I think we've all been a part of, and you don't want to overload the agenda and include too much, which we've also all been a part of. On underloading, I've traveled 3 hours to meetings where it's been a 20-minute discussion, and that's been consistent with particular boards. I leave scratching my head thinking, what just happened? I can only imagine how a board might feel in those particular settings and situations. So underloading and overloading fall on each end of the spectrum, right? So to find the sweet spot, what you want to be able to do is keep your agenda substantive. So what do I mean by substantive? You want to spend the majority of your time talking about at the board table, in your board meetings, the subjects that matter most and really are incidental to your role as board governors, right? So what are those subjects? Obviously, you want to ensure that you're providing the students that you serve the best academic opportunity possible. So academics, very substantive part of your board meeting agenda. You want to make sure that you're discussing those operational inputs, right, relative to those outcomes. So some of you that have heard me speak in the past, you've probably remembered seeing a PowerPoint slide where I have a diagram that talks about inputs, outputs, outcomes, right? So I address inputs as the resources, right? The resources that have been given to the academy. I discuss outputs as the delivery on those resources and the outcomes on what is the benefit yielded relative to those inputs and outputs, which is really the board concern, right? The outcomes. But for purposes of substantive information, what you really want to be thinking about is what about those business operations, and we could classify those as the inputs, right? What about those business operations are going to get us to a conversation that gets informative information to the board about academic outcomes? I mean, that's just an example of a substantive measure to discuss at board meetings. But I would also say this to you, as you look at what's substantive about an agenda, I think you really need to spend some time reflecting on what your role is as board members, right? Why are you in the position that you're in? What is it that you're expected to do at the board meeting, right? You're expected to make decisions, right? You're expected to maybe engage in problem solving. You're expected to plan, right? So to provide some strategic direction to your leadership, and you're expected to assess, right? Assess what you're hearing, assess that reporting, assess those outcomes relative to maybe the goals that you've established. So keeping an agenda substantive is not necessarily just about adding the things that you think it's important. It's really about reflecting again on your role and what is expected of you as you gather as a board to engage in board business relative to the schools that you're overseeing. So you might want to look at, okay, as we're looking at those business operations, those inputs, as I said, you know, again, what about those are yielding high academic outcomes and what about them are not, and discuss those and solve those problems together. So that's sort of an example without getting into too much detail, spending too much time on that, what I mean by keeping the agenda substantive. If you can figure that out, then again, you're at that sweet spot between underloading and overloading. And then the third element that sort of ties in with that is developing your agenda for meeting sprints, not marathons, right? So that's a little bit on the overloading, as I talked about in element 1. And when I say sprints, I don't mean a 20-minute meeting. When I say develop your agenda for meeting sprints, not marathons, I'm talking about that definition of a sprint that talks about a brief spell of great activity, right? So you want a meeting that is going to include conversation around great activity, right? So what does that look like for you? I'm going to make a suggestion here that you might just want to think about individually and or with your collective boards, ideally with your collective boards. We oftentimes, all the time, right, we discuss the meeting start time, right? That's what's posted, that's what's required of us. So we're going to meet every second Monday at 6 o'clock. But what about an end time? We don't necessarily have to include an end time on our board meeting calendar or postings, but I would encourage you to think about a time frame for your meetings and resolve to commit to that time frame. And the reason why I suggest that you do this is because obviously if you say we're going to meet the second Monday of every month from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, then you build your agenda to accommodate that time frame, right? So another way to find that sweet spot between underloading and overloading is to really think about what that meeting time frame should look like for you. And I'll just tell you, I rarely engage in meetings where I don't have a start time and an end time. And I understand it's a little bit different for me because I don't have, you know, rules and regulations to follow relative to public meetings. But I do think, again, it helps me in terms of identifying how much time I'm going to spend on agenda development and what I'm going to include when I know I only have an hour and a half or 2 hours to speak to certain subjects or certain areas. So just something to think about versus those marathon meetings, right, which is just a subject dump. So these are the meetings, you know, these are the 3-hour meetings, right, that include everything and the kitchen sink for conversation. So again, just find that sweet spot. Think about this, think about that time frame, how you maybe want to, from this point forward, develop the timing of your meetings and really start building your agenda to accommodate that. I would encourage you to do that. And I would also suggest for thoughtful agenda development that you start formally tracking carryover agenda items. So again, some of you that have heard me speak in professional development settings have heard me say that at the end of every meeting, what you might want to do, just as an example, take 10 minutes and identify those areas that have surfaced that you know right now at the end of your existing meeting, you're going to talk about at the next meeting, right? Because we know that even though the items are on the agenda, they can't always be covered because perhaps you're not ready to talk about them, board, you're not ready to make decisions, whatever the case may be. So again, this gets to sort of the substantive part of the agenda development, is ensuring that you're tracking those carryover items so at the next meeting, you know that you're covering those items that to you at the existing meeting were substantive in nature. So you can assign someone to this. It doesn't have to be the board president, by the way. It can be someone else on the board to start tracking those items that have surfaced and then discuss them at the end of your meeting. Agree through conversation that they're going to carry over to the next agenda for the next meeting. And then finally, when you start thinking thoughtfully about agenda development, I want to just say to you, I understand that throughout the academic year, there are a whole lot of events and activities that surface that you need to consider at some point during your board meeting. So I've given you examples here. So for example, right now, I think most of you are probably undergoing an WEA testing. I think the month of October is the time for that. So when are you going to discuss those outcomes? Is it going to be November? Is it going to be December? Provide for that on your agenda. Student application and enrollment, for example. You know that every year there's a student application and enrollment period. It's typically late winter, early spring, I think, for most schools. So when are you going to discuss that on the board meeting agenda in terms of how that concluded? What does it look like for return students? How many students are on the waiting list? How many new students have we enrolled? So what does that conversation look like? You're expected every year to hold an annual meeting where you elect officers, where you maybe appoint legal counsel. You know what your annual or organizational meetings look like. How does that fit into your standard agenda? And again, do you need to adjust your standard agenda to provide for that? So if now you are, as a board, resolving to meet 90 minutes, 2 hours, the second Monday of every month, how does this annual meeting discussion accommodate that relative to any other agenda subjects that you need to discuss in that given month? And that's typically what, really late spring, early summer, when I think most boards hold those, maybe getting into late summer for some. Your budget hearing, you're expected to hold a budget hearing annually. What does that look like in terms of agenda placement? Are you going to place that in your standard meeting agenda, close out your public meeting, go into your budget hearing? Are you going to hold a separate budget hearing prior to your board meeting? What kind of consideration are you giving that? A lot of you on the line, I think, operate from a master calendar of reporting requirements, for example. So a lot of what I'm talking about in this particular section is identified in your master calendar of reporting requirements. But again, use that master calendar of reporting requirements to determine where throughout the academic year you want to discuss certain things relative to what's due based on that master calendar. That can be used as one guide for thoughtful agenda development. And finally, closed meetings, closed sessions. If you're going to hold those, what does that look like? Again, in terms of your agenda timing, the timing of your meeting. If you know you're going to have to go into closed session to discuss something for a lengthy period of time, where are you going to discuss the other agenda items that you're planning on discussing, and do you need to? at this particular meeting, right? Do you need to? So just a quick note here with respect to closed sessions. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time because procedurally we're going to talk about, I think, as I mentioned in the next session, this topic. But remember, when you're talking about closed session, there are limited purposes for you to go into closed sessions, right? I think most of you know that, but I just feel compelled to remind you as we're gathered together this evening. So obviously, personnel issues, some student discipline, suspension issues, perhaps expulsion issues, consideration, purchase, or lease of real property, to consult with legal counsel. So again, there are only about 4 or 5 purposes for going into closed session. So I will just offer to you, again, in the spirit of planning out that agenda development, if you have a closed session item that you need to include on the agenda and you need to be sensitive to your own meeting time, if you have questions relative to that closed session placement or the closed session procedurally, I would just ask that you consult your authorizer. But again, in terms of agenda development, these are just other things that you might want to consider as substantive as you look at keeping the agenda that way from this point forward. So I'm going to pause for a minute, and this is where I'm going to invite any comments, feedback, questions relative to thoughtful agenda development. Oh, one other item too, just quickly, I'm sorry, about agenda placement. Also, I want to remind you about board reappointments, right? You all know, or you should know, you have a list of your board terms. You know when board terms are expiring. So again, how are you planning for that relative to agenda development? At what point are you talking about those folks whose terms are expiring and the reappointment process? So that's another item that I want to bring to your attention as well relative to agenda placement and discussion. So now I'll stop for a minute and see if anybody else has thoughts, questions, comments. Hi, Anita, do you have a question?
No.
Okay, your hand was up, so okay, no problem. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just looking through the list to see if I see any hands raised, looking at the question pane to see if there are any questions. I think I've answered those. So just bear with me, please, as I look through these. Great, I think I covered those areas. So very good. So that is all about thoughtful agenda development. Now we're going to discuss the next slide, which is how should we be thinking about comprehensively reviewing our board meeting materials, including our agenda. So the first area that I want to cover here is about timing, right? So in order for you as board members to review your materials comprehensively, you need to be certain that you're getting them enough in advance of your board meeting that you can interact with them, right? So if you're getting your stack of board meeting materials a day or two prior to the meeting, I'm going to tell you that's not acceptable. In my opinion, you need at least a week to be able to thoughtfully review your agenda and all of the supporting materials that you're expected to come to the meeting to know something about and make decisions on. So if you, again, are a board that's getting your materials only a couple of days in advance, if you take nothing else away from this session, I would say to you, please go back, and whomever is providing you with those materials and that board meeting agenda, please let them know as a board that you need them at least 5 to 7 days prior to the board meeting from this point forward. Now, when you're looking at your board meeting materials, then when you're reviewing your materials, reviewing your agenda, I want you to keep this in mind. When you come to board meetings, right? So we talked about a little bit in the agenda development session, what it is that's expected of you as a board. So this is sort of a more global, higher level expectation. It's expected, and you should expect this of yourselves, that you are coming to your board meetings to get questions answered and deliberate on policy matters, right? So in order for you to get questions answered, you need to have had time to review the materials to develop the questions, right? If that's what you believe, if that's your philosophical approach to board membership. So before I go any further, I want to just talk a minute about this whole notion of deliberating on policy matters, because I know we use this term a lot, and I'm sure that some board members, and that's okay, are thinking, I don't really know practically how to do that. So I had an opportunity to meet with the board a couple of weeks ago, a couple of members, I think, are on this session this evening, and this is exactly what we talked about. How do you take what's going to be discussed at your board meeting and apply it to policy? So those of you that have board policies, whether you use the institutes, the National Charter Schools Institute's board policies, or have your own, really have a gold mine at your fingertips, right? And what do I mean by that? You have an opportunity to really effectuate this whole notion of deliberating on policy matters if indeed you understand what you have for board policies. So ensuring you know what's in your board policy deck, and then again applying them particularly in the review of your board meeting agenda and board meeting materials, and then bringing that dialogue to the board table when you gather and convene a meeting as a full board. So again, how does this work practically speaking? And I don't want to belabor this too much, because this is probably a whole webinar session in and of itself, but I just feel like I want to just sort of elaborate on this a bit. So if you see, let's say you're reviewing your board meeting agenda and you see something about school climate, whatever that might look like. It might be an engagement issue. Maybe your students aren't engaged and there needs to be discussion about it. What policies do you have in place that have been written to address school climate, right? And when again, school climate, I use engagement as an example, but it's really about engagement, safety, and environment, right? So when we look at school climate, we're really looking at those three key areas. So if you think about that relative to policy, here's an example of some of the policies that you have in place that you could apply to your school climate agenda and materials review, your technology use and internet policy, your parent involvement policy, your student discipline policy, your school safety policy, your anti-bullying policy, your wellness policy. So again, just one example of how when you're reviewing your board meeting materials, your agenda, and the supporting materials, you can really try to use policy that's in place to help you really deliberate on those policy matters, and then bring those questions forth at the board meeting table. So again, I won't get into a whole lot of discussion. Because I mentioned deliberating on policy matters, and I've referred to that over the past several years in my session, I thought it was just this time to explain that a little bit. But again, when you're reviewing your board meeting materials and board meeting agenda and supporting materials, maybe it would be of interest to you to have some kind of template that you can use to help really think through some critical questions that you can then bring to the board table. So again, for those of you that have worked with me, you know that I've developed exactly that. It's a board meeting review template that really starts with looking at the agenda, right? So it's laid out to cover certain subjects. So first, as I'm reviewing the agenda, so for example, here are some of the questions that you might be asking yourself, just the agenda alone. Does the agenda appear to be conducive to what now might be a 90-minute, 2-hour meeting, right? Does any of the agenda items appear to have any critical policy implications other than what I just shared with you? So what on the agenda seems to be policy related? So another example that I like to give, if you see something on the agenda related to facility use, you know, I think most of you on the line probably have a facility use policy. Referring to that policy relative to your agenda review is another way that you can apply that deliberation on policy matters. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of policy implications. And then my template goes on, and this is just an example. You can create your own. I'm not advertising my template, but I will offer it to any of you that are interested after this session. Academic, so it offers a whole series of questions relative to academics. Finances, whole series of questions relative to finances. Operational issues, whole series of questions relative to operational issues. And then finally, are there any other sort of climate, other cultural kinds of issues that are on the agenda that need to be discussed? And there's a whole series of questions that apply to those as well. So again, just an example of how you might want to use some kind of questions template as you're now comprehensively reviewing your materials and thoughtfully thinking about your agenda. And number 3, I just talked a little bit about that, reviewing your materials in accordance with board adopted policy. So really looking at what's on the agenda, those materials, and really thinking about what those policies are that the board has adopted and how are the provisions of the policy aligning with the materials that I'm seeing in my board meeting packet, whether it be the agenda or the board meeting materials themselves. And then when you're comprehensively reviewing the materials, there might be questions that surface that you might not want to wait until the meeting to ask. So for example, I think one of the questions that I ask on my board meeting template is there anything on the agenda that is completely unfamiliar to me as a board member? Do I need even more information to think about the question that I want to raise and bring to the board meeting table? If that's the case, then what's your procedure for routing those questions about the information to be discussed at the meeting? So one other thoughtful way that you can think about comprehensively reviewing the materials. But again, this is all in the spirit of coming to the meeting prepared, right? Coming to the board meeting prepared to effectuate your role as governors, right? As the highest level of leadership for the schools over which you govern, over which you serve. So again, I'm going to stop for a minute. I'm going to invite questions, comments, feedback, and then we'll move on to how do we then effectively manage this agenda that we have thoughtfully developed and comprehensively reviewed. I will say to you too, I know sometimes in the throes of these discussions, you can't always think about questions, comments, thoughts while we're discussing. So if anything comes up, surfaces in your mind later, just pop me an email. I see a hand raised. David, do you have a question or thought you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do, especially in regard to item 3, with the board adopted policies. Our
Yeah,
manual at one time was somewhere in the vicinity of about 4
right.
inches thick.
Right.
Um, how do you, or what do you recommend as far as trying to
Yeah.
review the board policies to what you're talking about in the particular board meeting that month?
Sure, sure. So you obviously have the Institute's comprehensive
Yes, we do.
board policy. Yeah, and it is comprehensive. I'll
It
give you
is.
that. It is. So David, I would say to you this, obviously with that many policies, you're not going to be able to fully memorize all the provisions in each. So when I talk about reviewing materials in accordance with board policy, I'm talking about generally knowing what you have in terms of board policy subjects, right? So those of you that have the Institute service, you have a table of contents for each section of your board policy manual, right? So when you're looking at your board meeting agenda, if you see some kind, of personnel discussion, you're going to flip to maybe the personnel table of contents. You're going to maybe see a policy that looks like it might apply to that particular subject. You're maybe going to look over that policy that appears to be aligned with the subject on the agenda, and just develop your questions, thoughts from the provisions of that policy, right? So this is where I would say to you, effectively use your table of contents if you have the Institute's board comprehensive policies, because in my prior life, I was a vice president of the National Charter Schools Institute, and I served as interim president for a while. So as vice president, I oversaw all things board related, including the board policy service. So I certainly understand that that is just a boatload of policies, but I would say to you in that case, just become intimately familiar with the table of contents for each of those sections for the policy subjects, and then just take it from there.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, I can give that a try.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. So seeing no other questions or hands up, I did see, just for those of you that placed some thoughts in the questions pane about the review template, I will certainly get those to you. I did see those comments. So please know that I will get the templates to you as soon as possible. So again, we've thoughtfully developed, we've comprehensively reviewed the agenda and supporting materials. So now how are we going to manage this at the board meeting, right? So I'm going to say to you, first and foremost, effectively managing the agenda at the board meeting is not just the job of the board president. Okay, the board president's role, as your bylaws state, is to preside, right, over all meetings of the Academy board. That's really all it says. And to then obviously perform all duties incident to the office of the president of the board as may be prescribed by the Academy board from time to time. That's coming right out of your bylaws. It is not just the responsibility of the board president to manage the agenda. So the expectation is that if you are serving on a board, which most of you are, except those that are representing the authorizer office, the expectation is that you will come to the board meetings prepared, right? That you will come to the board meetings prepared to ask questions, make decisions, deliberate on policy matters, help solve problems, help plan and assess, all those things that we've talked about this evening, right? That is the expectation of all of you, not just the role of the board president. So first, I want to just emphasize that to you. And I would also tell you that now, if you've resolved to establish a time frame for your meetings, if you've resolved to say we're going to meet from 6 to 8, for example, the second Monday of every month, then what you need to start thinking about is how are we going to time out agenda discussion. So I had the privilege of working with a Detroit board several years ago in a coaching capacity. I think some of them are on the line as well. And one of the things that we did was exactly this. They, because of situations that had surfaced at the academy, their meetings were very long, and they knew that. So they wanted to try to shorten them up. So one of the things that we did was we started setting time limits per discussion on the agenda items. So we would say, you know, management report 10 to 15 minutes, treasurer's report 5 minutes, and really get those time frames in a place where now the meeting became manageable, both efficient and effective, right? So efficiency is relative to the time frames in which they wanted to start conducting their meetings, and effective in terms of forcing those salient points during reporting, because everybody knew that they only had certain amounts of time to do that. So if you're going to, you know, take seriously this whole notion of setting time frames, then the next step in that is to apply those time frames to your agenda at the board meeting. So some of you, again, that have participated in some of my sessions in the past have heard me talk about what we always talked about at the Institute, which is the 30-30-30 agenda, right? That is suggesting a 90-minute meeting where for 30 minutes you talk about academics, 30 minutes you talk about operations, and 30 minutes you might talk about board professional development. That's the one thing that we emphasized when I was at the Institute. I'm going to say to you tonight that another way to think about how you manage your meeting through your agenda is to spend about 25% of your time on those sort of mechanical issues. So every meeting you've got, opening the meeting, approving the agenda, approving the minutes. You might have consent agenda items, again, which we'll talk about that at the next meeting when we talk about orderly meetings. You might have even the treasurer's report. You can include in there public comment if that's at the opening of your meeting. So all of those sort of mechanical issues that you have to do, it's just part of what's expected of you pursuant to your role as board members, what the authorizer expects, what your bylaws expect, what the Open Meetings Act expects. 25%, right? And then, so 25, if my math is correct, which I'm always a little rusty on math. So in a 90-minute meeting, you're spending, not more than, let's say, 20 to 22 minutes on those kinds of items. And then the remaining 75% of the meeting, you're talking about those some substantive board items, those board agenda items that you now have developed, right, as a board based on this webinar session this evening. So just think about that, relative to your board meeting agenda. And even, let's say, even if you don't commit to an exact time, even if you feel like, ooh, that makes me nervous, start thinking about maybe setting some time limits, right? And just see how different the board meeting might proceed if indeed you have time limits established for some of those conversations, for some of those reporting items. So something to think about there. Another a way to think about effectively managing your agenda is to know when to establish committees. And I offer this, and again, those of you that have engaged in my professional development meetings have seen that this is one of those board best practices that I talk about. So sometimes the same subject over and over and over, month to month to month, right, can monopolize a board meeting, right? So if you see a consistent subject where there is ultimately no resolution over a certain period of time, then think about establishing a committee to bring some resolution to that particular topic. Because remember, committees are really established to help do exactly what we're talking about tonight, bring efficiencies to the board meeting, right? So instead of talking about these subjects to no end, you're now hearing the committee report and you're making some wise decisions based on those committee reports, or you are continuing discussion through the committee, depending upon what the subject might be. So just think about that relative to effective agenda management. And then finally, as we've been talking about, using those meetings to get questions answered and deliberate on policy matters. So I mentioned to you that I worked with the board on this particular topic not so long ago. So what I did for them is I actually took one of their board meeting agendas and just kind of highlighted those areas, those subjects on the board meeting agenda that might, for example, have some, again, further policy considerations. So in practice, relative to how you're effectively managing the agenda at the meeting, an example, I took management reports. I had a principal report, 2017, 2018 contract goals report, board fund report. I cross-referenced that to some other policies. So looking at, for example, the contract goals progress report, what policies do they have in place that might have some kind of alignment to that goals report? First Amendment policy, and this is their policy in particular that talks about curriculum and those items that might have some kind of adverse impact on the First Amendment. Parent involvement policy, admission and enrollment policy, student discipline policy, some of those that we talked about, seclusion and restraint policy. You get the idea. And as we looked at board fund report, their budget policy, fiscal management policy, deposit policy, purchasing policy. So what are those provisions included in those policies that might have some policy implication to those particular agenda items? And then as another example, they have discussion items on their agenda, annual board development and evaluation. What discussion items, what policy items might be impacted, or might that discussion be impacted by? Board member qualification policy, board powers policy, conflict of interest policy, fiscal related policy. So you just see, again, David, you asked that question earlier. You see in practice what that might look like. So what I did for them is looked at their policy deck, looked at the table of contents, and then highlighted those policies relative to what I saw on the agenda. So there are different kinds of ways you can really look at policy relative to your board meeting agenda. That's just one of them that I wanted to emphasize this evening. So again, that's for effective agenda management. I think that's it. One thing I will say to board presidents as well. So if you're a board president and you're on the line and you're thinking about effective agenda management, because I do think oftentimes this becomes a burden of the board president just by default. If you want to really effectively manage the agenda, think about ways that you can assign certain agenda subjects to your respective board colleagues. Assign a subject or two to them. If it's not already outsourced to someone else. This really does two things. Number one, it takes the burden off the board president of trying to manage that agenda, him or herself. But number two, if you're looking at leadership succession, this gives you maybe a sense of, based on the subjects that are being discussed, the research that has been experienced to get to that discussion, all of those sort of leadership qualities that you as a board might like to see in a successor board president. This is a good way to maybe leverage that thinking as well. And not only that, but to get your board colleagues in a position where they're comfortable leading conversation to get them in a position where maybe at some point they will take over that board presidency role. So for those of you that have been serving as board presidents for 25 years, maybe this is an opportunity as you think about it to really find someone on the board who can succeed you in that leadership role, who might get comfortable with that just based on those assignments, and with whom you might be comfortable allowing for that to happen, and the full board allowing for that to happen. So another reason why it might be a good idea to sort of assign out some of those agenda subjects and this whole notion of agenda management. So I'm pausing again. I'm sorry. I just went right down to my questions pane and didn't even tell you that I'm pausing again to just see if there are any hands up, any unanswered questions. So I'm looking, scrolling through. I see more requests for the template that I referred to, both to the authorizers as well as schools. So I will certainly get those out accordingly. So thank you for your interest in that template. Some were very emphatic about it, wanting the template as soon as possible. And I'll just share with you anything that I share with you, whether it be a template, anything else that I give, feel free to make it your own. I don't want you to ever feel that you have to just use that as is simply because I gave it to you. I'm very free with my materials, and I want them to serve as tools to help you improve your practices. So if anything I ever send to you based on, pursuant to this discussion or any subsequent discussions, just know that I want you to make those your own. So I don't see any other thoughts. So we're going to kind of move in just quickly because, again, this could be another agenda or another webinar topic in and of itself. But as I was developing this PowerPoint for this evening's discussion, I couldn't help but think about this whole notion of board culture, right? So as we look at meeting effectiveness and efficiency, I just kept hearing the little voice in my head asking, what about board culture, right? How does that impact meeting effectiveness and efficiency? And actually, I will tell you, this has been sort of a hot button topic of mine for probably the past 6 months to a year, because it's not something that historically we spent a lot of time talking about, but I think it is really, really important to the role of the board as well as board recruitment. So I just want to touch upon this because, just as I said, culture, it could be a subject in and of itself. So let's just walk through these last couple of slides before we close out. This is what our friends at BoardSource say about board culture. And again, this is all relative to efficient and effective meetings, right? So again, how does culture play into that? Board culture has a significant influence on the way your board carries out its work and shapes your board performance. So I would say this to you, in addition to all of the other pieces that we talked about regarding agenda review, agenda development, agenda management at the board meeting, I want you to leave tonight thinking about philosophically your own board culture. What is that culture? What are those traditions, habits, beliefs that you've established as a board over time that guide your behavior? That's what we're talking about, right, when we're talking about board culture. So identify, document your board culture. Think about those traditions, habits established over time. What are your board's cultural expectations? And then finally, how do those expectations translate to productive meetings? So here's a perfect example relative to what we've been talking about tonight. Do you believe that you've established a board culture of preparedness? okay? Just general preparedness. So you as a board are committed to coming to the meetings absolutely prepared to discuss board business every month or every other month, however often you meet. That's a cultural expectation of yours. What other cultural expectations have you established that can really support this notion of effective and efficient meetings? So I want you to think about that, right? Again, that's another homework assignment for you as we work through these final slides of the session this evening. And anything else that you can think about that helps determine to you what your board culture is or what it might look like. So that same board that I worked with that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this topic came up, and it came up actually in the discussion around board recruitment, because what I said to that group and what I'll say to all of you, and I know this isn't a session of recruitment, but again, I feel compelled to talk about this, is when you, I would say to you, once you identify your board culture, board recruitment becomes a little bit easier, because now you're recruiting folks, you're identifying and recruiting folks that fit into the culture that you've established, and recognizing those people that don't fit in relative to the process that you've established as a board. So another reason why identifying your board culture, identifying the document is important. And again, you'll probably see this in a webinar session in the future, but for now, just wanted to bring it up in the spirit of efficient and effective meetings. And then, really close, what are those characteristics of a strong board culture, right? So I list 4 for you as you're thinking about your own board culture and what that looks like. A healthy and respectful partnership between and among all stakeholders. So for you, this is really, who are the three-legged stool. Some of you have indulged my three-legged stool conversation, where we've talked about board leadership and the authorizer, right? Those really are the 3 legs of that stool, and you're supporting performance, right? That's the three-legged stool conversation that we've had. So how are you encouraging a healthy and respectful partnership? What's your culture suggest about that? Is there trust and candor between board meetings? Is your board culture one of trust, one of candor? Can you honestly speak to each other, good, bad, indifferent, but respectfully, and trust each other relative to the work that you do as board governors? Is your culture thoughtful and productive in terms of resolving issues or disagreements? So how do you at the board table discuss issues? How do you disagree on issues? And then how do you get to a thoughtful and productive resolution? If you can do that with relative ease, then you've developed a strong board culture. And then finally, another characteristic of a strong board culture is, do you have a willingness to address poor board behavior that is negatively impacting the board? So for example, once you determine or identify your board culture, you need to hold your board members to that, right? So it gives you something to point to as a board and to speak to and to address with support if indeed poor board behavior is happening. So going back to the conversation on preparedness, if you've determined as a board that you've established a board culture of preparedness, and you've got board members that are not coming to the meetings prepared, clearly not prepared, you can point to your board culture as you identified as a board and say, wait a minute, this is not what you agreed to as a board member for ABC board, but yet this is the conduct that you're undertaking. So how should we be managing this? So again, I think once you establish that board culture, you commit to it, you can have good, healthy conversations regarding behavior that doesn't support that board culture relative to your collective board governance role. So again, just another set of ways to think about board culture in terms of this notion of efficient and effective board management. So tying this all together, what is it that we talked about tonight? And by the way, this is one of those sessions that I think is going to end a little bit early, so this is good. The goal is always, right, to engage in both effective and efficient meetings. Effectiveness and efficiency begins with thoughtful agenda preparation and includes with effective agenda management. And finally, board culture does play a significant role in yielding effective and efficient meetings. So those are sort of the, I think, messages, the resonating messages that I wanted to share with you this evening. So again, I'll be silent for a minute. That is the last slide, and invite questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, anything that you want to share. And again, I will say to you, please don't be shy, because I think the beauty in having so many people participating in these sessions is they can hear from their board colleagues. We can, in as much as we can through a webinar, engage in some dialogue around those questions, concerns, comments that are on your mind that are surely on the minds of your board colleagues. So if you heard anything tonight that resonated with you, that didn't, that confused you, where you had, you need clarification, now is the time to put it out there. And know too, like I said, after tonight, we can also, you should also feel free to text or email me. You all have my email address, so don't hesitate to ask any follow-up questions relative to what you heard this evening. So I think one of the questions that I saw, and I hope I answered this, was how do you determine board culture? And again, I think that's when we looked at, board culture defined, it really is about, again, those traditions and habits that you've held strong to and committed to as a board, and that you've established over time. But I think key to that is that guide your behavior, right? So what about those traditions and habits that have been established that guide your behavior and that have guided your behavior consistently, right? This is not just a one-off on, last week we did X, so that apparently is our board culture. This is over time. So it's really about reflecting on how you functioned as a board, identifying some of those, maybe key characteristics of a board, and then from those key characteristics, really sort of develop then what your board culture has become or what it looks like. I hope that answers the question that I saw in the questions pane. David, did you have another question, or was that from before?
No, I did have another question. I wasn't
Sure.
sure if that bar on that hand had to be green or red to get your attention.
That's okay, no problem.
The question I'm having is, when you say board culture, are you talking about the culture of the board as a whole, or the individuals on the board, what an individual culture is for each person, or maybe both?
Yeah. Right. I'm talking about the culture of the board as a whole when I talk about board culture, David. So, yes, I'm talking about the board culture as a whole. So as a collective governing body, what is the culture that you've created in effectuating your role as board governors?
Okay, because I know that each individual could have a very different culture, and you'd have to
Sure.
try and make sure everything blends together in order
Sure.
to get a whole culture as far as the board goes.
Right, and if you, and that's great, because if this is, if this is a task, for example, that your board would like to undertake, then I would recommend to you, there's nothing wrong with bringing the individual thoughts on culture to the board table to arrive at maybe from those individual pieces that collective board culture as it comes together through individual conversations. So that might be a way to sort of launch this discussion around board culture for your particular board, David.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Chris, I'm putting you on the spot here, but as the leader of the authorizing office at Lake Superior State University, do you have anything that you'd like to add or share with the collective group before we close this evening?
Not a whole lot, Angie. I appreciate all the information. I was taking some notes just in regards to, we discussed with the agenda in regards to the master calendar. And I know at Lake State, and I believe the other two authorizers as well, have created master calendars to help with not only state mandates, but also epicenter tasks that each authorizer. So those can also be, pieces of information that can help build that agenda for your monthly meetings. The other piece I was going to look into is the ability for board members to have access to the board policies right in Epicenter. And I'm not really completely sure if board members have access right away to that or the Epicenter users at each academy. And that may be a way to help have that information readily available to board members so they're not having to search through all those policies.
Right, yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure what, for those that have the Institute's policies, I'm not sure. I think they might be, I'm just not sure how to go about accessing that. So yeah, thank you. That would be good for them to understand. And some of you just with respect to board policy too, I think some authorizers require that the board policies be posted on your academy's respective websites. So if there's any question about what you have in terms of policies, there might be an opportunity to visit your websites and see if they're posted out there and if they're up to date as well. So very good. I'm not seeing any other questions. But again, if I can't emphasize enough, if you have any thoughts, concerns, questions that you think about later, don't hesitate to email me. I'm happy to answer them. I'm happy to get to those of you that asked for it, the guidance and wise questions template as you're reviewing your agenda materials. And once again, I just thank all of you so much for participating in this session, and I hope to see all of your names on my dashboard in January when we reconvene to, again, capitalize, as I mentioned, on this notion of efficiency and orderly meetings. So thank you to all of you, and have a good rest of the fall, and stay warm, please.